Hello, AP Environmental Science. This unit is about land, public and private, the land use concepts and how we classify them, and land management practices. Speaking of urban sprawl, if you have ever been on a small trip, you are familiar with this phenomenon called urban sprawl. Unurbanized areas that spread into rural areas and remove clear boundaries between the two is changing this landscape. And the landscape in those areas is characterized by clusters of housing and even retail shops, office parks, um, which are separated by miles of large roads and fields. So, large feeder roads and parking lots basically separate big box retail store areas from road pedestrian traffic. Urban sprawl has had a dramatic environmental impact on the United States, especially. Depending upon the automobile, it's definitely caused this urban response to our increase in population. So residents like to drive more than twice as much as people who live in cities in urban areas. So between 1950 and 2000, the number of vehicle miles traveled per person in the United States in suburban areas has tripled. So because suburban housing has a tendency to be significantly larger houses than in other urban areas, suburban communities also use more than twice as much land per person and housing and energy. Urban sprawl tends to occur at the edge of a city, often replacing farmland, and it starts to increase the distance between farms and the actual consumer. So, in the most recent survey, the U.S. Department of Agriculture estimated that between 1982 and 2007, U.S. farmland was being converted to residential use at a rate of about 1 million acres per year. There are four main causes of urban sprawl in the United States: automobiles and highway construction, cost of living, urban blight, and government policies are all main causes of urban sprawl. Before automobiles and highway systems ever existed, transportation in and out of cities was actually pretty difficult. Horses were slow, roads were bad, trolley services were rarely functioning, and they went oftentimes not even far beyond the city limits. So in those days, if you wanted to take advantage of the amenities of city life, like a job or something like that, you had to go move into the city. The automobile, however, has significantly changed all of this. And the development of interstate highway system in the 1950s and the 1960s basically changed everything. Today we think nothing of working in the city during the day and commuting home into our suburbs at night. And if you like to live in the suburbs, you want to get into the city on a Saturday night for dinner or for a concert or for a movie or something, that's not a problem either. So, with this rapid, comfortable transportation between urban and suburban areas, it's become possible to work and play in the city and then return to your large, quiet neighborhood with your great big old home that uses a ton of energy at night. And so, for the first time in history, people can enjoy essentially the best of both worlds. Land and the suburbs, because it's readily available, is relatively inexpensive when you compare land to the cost of land in the city. So, for the cost of a one tiny bedroom condo in a desirable city location, you might be able to purchase a 5 bedroom home with a great big backyard in the suburbs. In addition, because suburban governments often provide fewer public services than cities, like tax rates and all that, are oftentimes substantially lower. So, for all these reasons, moving to the suburbs allows people to enjoy a higher standard of living that they could not afford if they lived in the city. Although single family homes in the suburbs are likely to be less expensive and more desirable housing than in the city, they're still out of reach for many people. And because single family homes are usually the only housing option in the suburbs, those with lower incomes are often excluded. So most suburban communities have little or, if any, no low income or affordable housing. In many suburban locations, it is difficult to commute to the city without a car, so which compounds the difficulty for a lower income individual. Even when public transportation is available, commuting costs can actually be pretty high. If you look at this map right here, we can see this is Georgia from 1984 to 2016, just how urban sprawl has physically changed the overall landscape. And so we have all of these traffic issues, but essentially we are increasing our quality of life by spending 2 hours a day or more in traffic, I guess, as humans do. We've seen that urban sprawl encourages population shifts to the suburbs. As people leave the city, city revenue from sources like property taxes, property sales, and all of that begins to shrink. However, the cost of maintaining urban cities, including public transportation, the police department, the fire department, and social services, that does not decrease. Faced with declining taxes, cities are forced to reduce services, raise taxes, or a combination of both. So, as services decline, crime rates may increase, either because police resources are stretched thin or because conditions for lower income residents have declined. And that quality has been built into our environment. So, these problems contribute to a combination of higher taxes, made with cities, making cities less attractive to live in. And so those who can afford to move away from the city, they basically do. In addition, the population shifts to the suburb jobs and services also follow. Suburbanization has sprung up all of these suburban like office parks, which have led to an increase in suburb to suburb commuting. So commuting patterns develop around cities rather than into and out of cities. And so these new traffic patterns make it more difficult for public transportation to spread to this region. And so a wealthy and middle income people they're basically leaving the cities. And urban retail jobs are losing customers, and they're forced to close up shop. So these further decreasing customer bases for these stores that are in the cities. And so this, you can see that this is a cascading effect which leads to this positive feedback loop, right? So in this loop creates what we call urban blight. And that is the degradation of the built and social environment of the city that often accompanies the acceleration and migration out to the suburbs. So historically, urban blight has contributed to racial segregation, and in the 1950s and 60s, when migration to the suburbs began at its earliest point, those leaving the cities for the suburbs were predominantly middle or upper class Caucasians. They were called white flight, which resulted in a high concentration of minority populations living in the actual inner cities and almost entirely white population out in the suburbs. So over time, the disparity and opportunity increased because of tax revenues in the suburban communities often allowed for better schools. So in the number of U.S. cities, some of the segregation has begun to decline as Caucasians return to the cities and more minorities are leaving with accumulated wealth out to the suburbs. In addition, many young professionals are making the decision to work and live in cities despite all the racial disparities that are still there. Urban sprawl has also enhanced by federal and local laws and policies, including the highway trust funding and zoning laws and subsidized mortgages. So the Highway Trust Fund began by the Highway Revenue Act of 1956, and it was funded by the federal gasoline tax, which pays for the construction and maintenance of all the roadways and highways in the U.S. We have already seen that the highways allow people to live farther and farther away from where they work, resulting in this positive feedback loop. But more highways mean more driving and more gasoline purchases, which lead to more gasoline taxes and receipts, and then they pay for more roads and so on and so on. As people move farther away from their jobs, traffic congestion increases and the roads are expanded. But this new, even larger roadway encourages even more people to live further and further away from work. And this cycle exemplifies the phenomenon known as induced demand, in which is the increase of the supply of good causes demands to grow. So when I was your age, this was called the generated or the latent demand. And it is just basically the same thing, which is um, after the supply is increased, more goods will be consumed. Governments may use zoning to address issues of traffic congestion, urban sprawl, and urban blight. Zoning is a planning tool developed in the 1920s and used to separate industry and businesses from residential neighborhoods, thereby creating a more safer community. Governments that use zoning can be classified into, they classified land areas into zones. Uh, for instance, zoning ordinance might prohibit a developer from building a factory right next to a strip mall, or by building a multi-dwelling apartment area in a residential designated area. Nearly all metropolitan governments across the U.S. have adopted some sort of zoning regulation. These zoning laws have been helpful in addressing issues of safety and sometimes minimizing environmental damage that can be caused by like new construction. So one negative aspect of zoning is that it generally prohibits suburban neighborhoods from developing a traditional main street, with shops and apartments and housing and businesses that can operate like in a cluster. So many communities are now attempting to incorporate a multi-zoning or multi-use zoning area, which allows retail and high-density residential development to coexist in the same area. However, most zoning in the U.S. continues to promote automobile-dependent development. Period. Demand and cause for traffic congestion and urban sprawl. So the use of gasoline tax money to build highways tends to lead to the development of suburbs and traffic congestion, at which point yet more money is spent on highways to alleviate the congestion. And then the green arrow indicates in this diagram the starting point of the actual cycle, increased gasoline tax revenues.